coming to our second lecture in this year's annual lecture series. As you know, we've expanded our lecture series dramatically, and we are so thrilled to see such a wonderful turnout. We are able to do this because of a very generous grant from Virginia Humanities and the absolute wonderful support that the American Frontier Foundation is giving the museum on a regular basis. And in order to provide you with such wonderful programs, I would love for you if you could fill out a survey, which we have over there on the table at the end of the lecture. That way we get your input. We can hear from you directly what it is that you're looking for from the Frontier Culture Museum. But without further ado, I would love to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Ken Koons. He is the General Edwin Cox Institute Professor of History at Virginia Military Institute, where he has taught since 1982. His signature course is The History of Everyday Life. Other courses include Food and Hunger in History and a research seminar on the social and economic history of the Shenandoah Valley. His publications focus on commercial wheat farming, manufacturing activity, and slavery and its aftermath in the 19th century Shenandoah Valley. In the realm of public history, Koons has served as a consultant to museums, government agencies, law firms, and various non-profit organizations on issues relating to the history of agriculture and rural life. He holds a Doctor of Arts degree in history from Carnegie Mellon University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ken Koons.
Thank you for that nice introduction. First things first, can everybody hear me okay? I just put on a mic. No? So what do I do? Should I move this higher?
Yeah.
How about now? Higher? How about now?
Same.
Get a hearing aid.
So the title of my talk is Farms, Mills, and Shops. How did you hear that?
Good.
Good? Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I am truly surprised that so many people cared about the economic history of our valley, but it's heartening to see this crowd. So my purpose this evening is to provide a very general, very broad overview of the workings of the regional economy in the Shenandoah Valley from about the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. You see my title here, and it's the dates are 1750 to 1850, a little program note. I submitted this title months ago, and then as I started to prepare it, I decided I needed to use some data from 1860. So I pushed forward just a little past 1850, and you'll see this as the evening goes on. I don't think that's a problem, but I did want to mention that. I want to begin by focusing on the title for a couple of minutes, and obviously you see the title there. There are three words there that I want us to focus on for just a bit. Obviously, farm is one of them, mill, and shop. I want to focus on these words because they're broadly indicative of three different types of economic activity. Historians, I guess economists as well, we often refer to these as sectors of the economy. They existed ever since the Neolithic Revolution. Once you have agriculture, you have these other two sectors as well. And so if we understand these three ways of this way, I should say, of categorizing economic activity, it will help to frame our discussions for the evening. This term, economic activity, by the way, I grant you it's a bit cumbersome, but I encourage you to think of it simply as what everyday, ordinary people did for jobs in the past, how they earned livelihoods for themselves. And on one level, what we're looking at here is what one historian has recently called the history of plain folk employment. What did plain folk do to earn livelihoods for themselves? And so here are the three sectors then. Again, with the farm, this is what we would call the agricultural sector, sometimes in the literature referred to as the primary sector. And it's farming, basically. It's producing food and fiber, but it also is extractive industries. We'll talk about some of these a little later on. For example, mining iron ore in the valley would be an extractive industry. Lumbering is considered an extractive industry. And then under mill, we have the manufacturing sector, the secondary sector. This is making stuff. This is artisans or craftspeople making things, or the processing of raw materials. And typically, as we'll see, these raw materials are produced by folks in the primary sector. And then we have under shop what we call the service sector or the tertiary sector. This is such occupations as buying stuff, selling things, as examples, but it also includes laborers, and I'll have something to say about that later on this evening. And so a couple of additional notes here before we move on. First off, manufacturing is a word that requires a little bit of care in how we use it, how we understand it. It results in a finished good that is made from crops or raw materials, but the interesting point to me is that in the original meaning of that term, it meant to make something by hand. And so we can have manufactured goods that didn't involve any kind of mechanical power. We see both. As we look at Valley history here, we'll see some goods are indeed made by hand. They're manufactured. And we'll also see some that are goods that are made by mechanical power. An additional complication is under the tertiary sector is that in pre-industrial economies, which is what we're talking about here this evening, it's sometimes hard to separate work in the manufacturing sector from that of the service sector. And think of a shoemaker, for example. So you could have a shoemaker in let's say, downtown Lexington, or downtown Stanton. We're in Stanton. Why not use our local example here? You could have a shoemaker in downtown Stanton in, say, 1840, 1850, and he could have a shop. And at the back of his shop, he could be manufacturing shoes, applying his tools, his skills, his know-how, making a pair of shoes. And we would think of that as manufacturing activity. But if he's got a storefront that when he finishes those shoes, he carries them up and puts them in his window for sale, and then when somebody comes in, he takes off his work apron and goes up front and says, "How can I help you today?" "Well, I'd like to buy a pair of shoes." Well, we would consider that the service sector. So we see some mixing here. We see some ambiguity, and we're going to note some of that this evening as we go on as well. So we're going to look at these various types of economic activities separately, but in the end, by the time we get to the end of the evening, I want to look at them together to show you, I hope, how the entire economy functions. The main argument that I want to put forward this evening, the takeaway point, if you will, is that farming, and this is no surprise to anyone in the room, I don't think, farming was the engine that powered the growth and development of the regional economy, but manufacturing also shaped the economy in critically important ways. Most historians who have examined the economic history of the Valley have focused on the enormous productivity of the agricultural sector, but this has caused them, I think, to downplay and quickly gloss over the contributions to manufacturing, the contributions of manufacturing in shaping the regional economy. Put another way, the agricultural sector dominated the economy, but the success of that sector depended absolutely on a large and vibrant manufacturing sector. In fact, the two must go together. They were interdependent. One could not succeed without the other. So that's the central message that I want to argue, put forward here this evening. Now, to begin, we need to talk about the geographic scope. I've said that this talk is about the Shenandoah Valley, and here you see it, a map of it. When I think of the Shenandoah Valley, I think of these various counties that you see here, starting with, I typically start with Frederick and Clark in the north if I'm doing statistical work, but there's a lot of interesting material that I draw from Berkeley and Jefferson as well, which of course, before the Civil War, where it was a part of Virginia as well. And then I go down to include Botetourt County. So this is the Shenandoah Valley. I think that most of my generalizations apply to the valley as a whole, but to try to take general trends and then show them playing out at the local level, I'll often refer to specific counties, and given where we are this evening, I try to focus mostly on Augusta and Rockbridge. Not exclusively, but mostly. And so we begin with the agricultural sector then. And to develop the historical organisms of agriculture here in the valley, we need a brief account of settlement. And this map is helpful for making this point. The earliest migrants to the valley came here from Pennsylvania, mostly. There are some exceptions. I don't think I need to get into those just now. But mostly from Pennsylvania. These are Scots-Irish, Germans, some English from Pennsylvania. And I wanted to show you this map because you can see the valley very clearly there, I think. This is a NASA photograph, by the way. And you can see the valley very clearly, and you can see how the natural corridor of travel from Pennsylvania. Let me see if I can figure out the... Yeah, there we go. So this up here, this is the Susquehanna River. Right here is the Potomac River, and so the valley, the Shenandoah Valley, is roughly from here to the south. Unfortunately, this map goes, what is that, probably about Wayers Gate, maybe, so north of us here. But again, sorry. So you can see then what a natural corridor of travel it is from Pennsylvania and how these various migrants from there wound up here. A really important point for us this evening is when these migrants came to Pennsylvania, they brought their agricultural methods with them. And generally speaking, we can call these agricultural methods general mixed farming. And if you're practicing general mixed farming, that means that there's an emphasis on diversity. Lots of crops and lots of different animals, livestock. And so farmers, migrants, mostly were farmers who came here to settle on the land. They grew wheat, corn, rye, barley, oats, buckwheat. Those are some of the main ones. There's some other, they grew maize, of course, to feed their livestock. And they also brought with them lots of livestock. And so I wanted to share some. This is a little anachronistic, so I'm describing what happened in the 1730s when these settlers first came here. These images that I'm going to show you now are by David Hunter Struther, who produced these in the 1850s. So this is a horse from the Northern Valley in the 1850s, as I said. This one is actually labeled Berkeley Springs, so that's today, West Virginia. So we have cows, pigs, sheep. This happens to be sheep that were in Clark County in the 1850s. And barnyard fowl, these are turkeys. And I'm getting ahead of myself here by showing you this one this early. But I'll let it there for now anyway. The first interest of initial settlers is to basically subsist on the land. They want to be self-sufficient, they're subsistence farmers, but they're commercially oriented. And what I mean by that is they have a desire to, they want to support themselves, they want to subsist, they're going to grow the crops they need to support themselves. But when the opportunity presents itself, they want to find a cash crop that they can produce and sell in the marketplace. If you're commercially oriented, it means you have an outright desire to do that. And I think another element of it is that you're looking hard to be responsive to the market. You want to grow what the market wants. You want to grow or produce what there is demand for. And one historian has called this the arrival of capitalism to the countryside. Farmers being responsive to market demand. So initially, Valley farmers focused on hemp and tobacco as cash crops. The Valley actually became a center of hemp production in Virginia during the middle decades of the 18th century. But the crop of long-term commercial importance was wheat. Its rise to commercial importance began in the 1750s when farmers began to grow increasing amounts of it to meet the demand for flour posed by British soldiers in the Valley fighting in the Seven Years' War. And that demand continued during the American Revolutionary War, and after that war, we see the emphasis on hemp and tobacco dwindle. Tobacco prices just plummeted, and subsidies for hemp died out as well. But demand for flour continued to increase, and so farmers, of course, began to continually increase the number of acres they devoted to wheat production. And so by the turn of the century, that is the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, the Valley had become so well known for growing wheat that one historian has called it the most important wheat and flour producing region in the entire South. Not just Virginia, but in the entire South. And so comprehensive statistical data to sort of support this notion becomes available in 1840. That's the first year when we have comprehensive statistical data. And what that data shows in 1840 is that farmers in the valley were working only 9% of the improved acres of land, but producing 22% of all the wheat produced in the state. Using 1850 data, a group of historians looked at 10 multi-county regions in the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia, 10 different ones, and they found that in one of those regions, the per capita production of wheat was a little under 6 bushels. In 8 of them, per capita production of wheat was under 1 bushel, but in the Valley of Virginia, it was 20 bushels. So it's again, it is the wheat producing region of the South. Excuse me. And it's also worth pointing out that wheat growing by this time had become nearly universal among farmers in the valley. In 1850, for example, 97% of all Augusta County farmers grew wheat, and 95% of all Rockbridge County farmers grew wheat in that year. One contemporary observer in the 1850s explained to a friend of his who lived outside the region, and I'm quoting here, "Wheat is the staple crop with us, and the only one not consumed at home." So again, this is the cash crop. They're sending it out of the region. This is the way they're making money. And another, also in the 1850s, another observer called the valley the great wheat-growing section of our state. So during the century from 1750 to 1850, we see high and rising wheat production. In 1850, in the valley as a whole, farmers grew almost 2.5 million bushels of wheat, and that's about 400,000 more than they grew in 1840, so production is rising. Locally here, farmers in Augusta County produced almost 420,000 bushels at mid-century. Farmers of Rockbridge, almost 200,000. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time imagining what a pile of wheat that is 200,000 bushels might look like. I'm not sure. But I think we can all agree that it's a lot of wheat. And there's a really important point that follows that, and here it is. In order for any of that wheat to be marketable, it had to be ground into flour in a grist mill. Wasn't marketable otherwise. Had very little value otherwise. And so, for the simple reason that wheat was not a marketable commodity until after farmers hauled it to a local grist mill and manufactured it, this is the word we want to use, they manufactured that wheat into flour. In fact, we often, I think it's common for us to think of people, proprietors of mills, we call them millers. And many people in the 19th century did too, but often they referred to them as, quote, manufacturers of flour. They were manufacturing flour in those mills. And so this brings us to the manufacturing sector of the valley economy. The processing of these tremendous amounts of wheat required the construction of large numbers of grist mills, as you might imagine. One historian estimates that by about the turn of the century, there were about 600 mills in the valley. Again, this is turn of the 18th to the 19th century. There were about 600 grist mills that had been built in the valley, approximately 400 in the northern valley and about 200 in its southern portion. And another historian, referencing the turn of the century also, he made the claim that there were, quote, upwards of 100 mills were built in 3 or 4 years in the counties of Rockingham, Augusta, and Rockbridge. So again, lots of farmers are raising their production of wheat, increasing their production of wheat, and in response to that, we see the building of many, many grist mills. And so much of this flour that is produced in valley mills was hauled to port cities outside the region, like Philadelphia, Baltimore, Alexandria, Richmond, and it's sold on international markets. So what's happening here, what's very important, it seems to me, is that the grist mills that are producing this flour link the Shenandoah Valley and the economic pursuits of its citizens to the national economy, but also to the international markets. And so I teach world history, and one of the things we talk about in world history is the rise of globalism in the modern era. And I tell my students that one marker of the emergence of a globally oriented economy is the increasing extent to which people produce for markets that lie far, far away from where they live. And so increasing globalism can be, again, a marker for it. You can recognize it's happening when somebody's producing something someplace in the world, and the end consumer is hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where it was produced. And that's what we see. That's the case here with wheat and flour in the late 18th, early decades of the 19th century. Local families made their daily bread with flour produced in nearby mills, but a large share of the flour manufactured in the valley was consumed by peoples living outside the region and even in foreign lands. And I've neglected my slides. So this is what wheat looks like. I imagine many of you know this. This is what is taken to the mill and converted to flour. Which mill is this?
I do not know.
Okay. Well, I was putting together these images and I wanted some mills, and I really liked this one that was on the publicity for the museum put together. So I don't know where it's from, but I liked it, and so here it is. You've seen it before if you saw the ad for this evening's talk. This is a stone mill, a limestone mill in the lower valley, which is to say the northern valley. Okay, this is near Winchester, and this, I should say, this is the artist here is a guy named James Taylor, who accompanied Sheridan, General Sheridan, in the Civil War as a sketch artist, and he sketched this nice mill. And here's another one by Taylor. Here's one closer to home. This is the McCormick Mill. Some of you probably recognize it down in Griffin, near Steele's Tavern. And here you note that beside the mill is another structure, the lower portion of which was a blacksmith shop, and this is where the reaper was made. It's hard to talk about wheat in the 19th century valley, particularly Rockbridge County, without at least pointing out that this is where the reaper was invented by Cyrus McCormick in the early 1830s. This is a mill on the edge of Fairfield called Sawmills. And so what we're seeing here then, what I've been talking about, is a very tight linkage between the primary and secondary sectors of the regional economy. There's a very close interdependence between farmers and millers. Mills, however, were utilized for purposes other than manufacturing manufacturing flour, and other types of manufacturing occurred in them as well. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that farmers raised a diversity of crops and livestock in this system of general mixed farming. But those other crops that they produced also gave opportunities for manufacturing entrepreneurs, we might call them, to process this food and fiber. Now, I want to take just a moment to step away from some of these crops we've been talking about and just briefly mention livestock. I'm not going to talk about livestock much this evening because I want to focus on processing, and they didn't process livestock much here except for home consumption. Livestock were driven in large numbers out of the valley to places like Philadelphia or Baltimore. This is a Struther sketch again, showing a cattle drive. And one of the things about cattle, one of the things farmers did focus on livestock. They made a lot of money from livestock, but they don't need to be hauled to market. They walk themselves to market, and that's what we see happening here. So I want to mention the principal examples then of these other forms of processing. Corn, for example, was fed to livestock and was also consumed by humans as well. Rye was sometimes used as a bread flour, but corn and rye, the excess corn and rye, were converted into whiskey, distilled into whiskey. And so there were distilleries up and down the valley, all through virtually every portion of the valley. One author has shown that by about 1800, the Shenandoah Valley was the largest regional producer of liquor in Virginia, and in Virginia certainly, but probably in the American South, he says. Of all the valley counties, Augusta had the highest production at about 250,000 gallons. I'm sorry, I didn't give a date. This is in 1810. There were about 80 distilleries in the valley producing about 800,000 gallons annually. but the largest, highest production was in Augusta County at about 250,000 gallons. And that trend continues into the late antebellum period and actually beyond. In 1850, for example, looking to Rockbridge just south of us, 11 distilleries processed 26,000 bushels of corn and rye into 61,000 gallons of whiskey. And much of this whiskey, I mean, it was consumed locally, of course, but a great deal of it was sent out of the region. It was exported from the region to other cities elsewhere. Apples and other fruits were processed into cider or distilled into brandies. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Slide again. I want to show you this. This is the Flax Mill in Rockbridge, Bass in Rockbridge County. But I wanted to show this page of an account book from there because Mr. Flax took the trouble to identify the uses to which his products were put. I don't know if you can read it from where you are, but so that's horse feed. This is bread. I can't quite read that. This is what, no, that's stills. This is the one I want to show to you, though. It's stills. So he's producing, grist mills did this all the time. They produce the mash that is then carried to the stills for the production of whiskey. So grist mills serve that function as well. And in fact, we'll see some grist mills. This is one of them. This is the Campbell, Lyle and Campbell Mill near Timber Ridge. If any of you know the Timber Ridge exit of Route 81, it's just off the exit. And I wanted to share this one with you because not only did they, again, grind flour and corn and so forth, but they also ran a distillery out of this grist mill. Many, not many, but certainly there are a lot of examples. I want to be careful about how I say this. Not all grist mills did this, but some grist mills certainly had distilleries attached to them. It was kind of a dual operation, and this was one of them. Animal hides were sold to local tanneries for processing into leather. There were tanneries scattered all through the valley. And again, they're present in large numbers. Most towns of any size had 2 or 3 tanneries within them because, you know, there are lots of livestock hides that need to be processed into leather. And they supplied, we'll see some of these occupations a little later on, they supplied saddlers, makers of footwear, boot and shoes, and also harness makers, and obviously anything made out of leather, but those were the main uses to which leather was put. Also interesting about leather is this. So all of these examples of locally produced raw materials that I've been talking about, they come from this area. So the corn, the rye, the wheat, it's all produced here. With leather, it too is produced here, but I found a couple of examples where this was a tannery in Broadway, up in sort of northwest Rockingham County. A tannery there in the late 1840s was sending agents to Baltimore to buy large numbers of hides and unprocessed hides and bring them back to his tannery for processing there. So that's the one instance I know of where they're actually going for raw materials outside of the valley. Wool was also processed into textiles in local woolen mills. This could happen in a number of different ways or a number of different steps involved. There were woolen mills where sometimes you read in the diary literature about farmers taking their raw fleeces to the local woolen mill and they would trade them for finished textiles. You also see grist mills that use the power of the water wheel through belting and whatnot. They power carding machines in their mills. So there's half a dozen or so mills in either one of these counties, Rockbridge or Augusta, that have a carding machine in them for the carding of wool. Flax seed. Farmers did grow a lot of flax. Flax, when one author argues that, and shows, and it doesn't just argue, but it shows convincingly, I think, that when settlers from Pennsylvania first started moving into the region, that you know they're practicing general mixed agriculture. Wheat was the crop of highest importance, followed by rye and then corn. But the fourth one, this surprised me, was flax. So they were producing a lot of flax, and this flax is put to a number of uses. One of which was for the production of oil. There were oil mills. This is something else I learned recently in preparing for this talk, and it surprised me. In the Shenandoah Valley in 1810, 23 of a total of 32 oil mills in the state were located here in the Shenandoah Valley. And Shenandoah County alone produced 15,000 gallons of oil per year. Again, I had not known that. That was interesting to me. And this is used, by the way, it's an ingredient in soap. It was also used as a drying agent in paints, I learned. Flax the plant, so I'm talking about flax seeds being processed for their oil. Flax the plant was also processed, and the fiber was used to produce linen. And this was a cultural practice carried to the valley by Scots-Irish immigrants, and so, oh sorry, this is another mill. Do you recognize this mill? I bet a lot of you have seen it. This is the Kennedy Wade Mill near Brownsburg. And I put it in here because in the middle of the 19th century, the owner at that time, a guy named Henry Jones, bought 2 presses that he incorporated into his mill for making apple cider. So this is flax seed, and I thank Dorette for sharing these photos with me. This is flax seed. This is the stalks themselves, and I will forego an explanation of what's going on here. Maybe we can have questions later on, but these are tools and equipment for processing the flax. And here you see, is that called a sketch?
Hackles.
Hackles, thank you, okay. And here's the spinning wheel for producing the finished textile. It's very interesting, too, that I had always thought that this was mostly domestic work done for, creating clothing for home consumption or maybe sale in the neighborhood. But it turns out this cloth produced with flax, Osnaburg is what is called. It's a coarse, plain, woven fabric, traditionally made with flax, but sometimes they incorporated other fibers into it, such as hemp, sometimes, for example. But apparently this was being sold in large amounts outside of the valley once again, even though it was mostly, not wholly, mostly domestic production. There were a couple of fulling mills. There was one here in Stanton, for example. There was one just a bit north of Brownsburg in northern Rockbridge County. Valley folks also produced linsey woolsey, as its name suggests, a mix of flax and wool. This became really important to the valley economy beginning in about the late 1740s and through the American Revolution, and then its demand for this diminished for a few years, and then we see it pick back up again in the late 1790s, and it continues to be important through the 1820s or so, but then gradually diminishes over time. And I'm assuming that is because the increasing availability of just really cheap cotton textiles from elsewhere. For a time, I played with the idea. Sorry, let me make sure I'm up with my slides. Yes. For a time, I played with the idea of using a different title for this lecture. I thought I might want to call it Processing the Bounty of Field and Forest, because so much of the economic activity in the manufacturing sector involves processing farmers' crops. But in the end, I decided not to use this title because other manufacturing enterprises important to the regional economy were not dependent upon agriculture as a source of raw materials. And here what I'm talking about principally are sawmills and iron furnaces and forges. Sawmills, this is Red Mill. It's located just a little west of Natural Bridge in Rockbridge County. And you can see here, it was a grist mill, but you can see that it's got the apparatus for sawing logs attached to it as well. And again, a lot of mills did this. Seasonally, they would focus on grains, and when the grains were slow, they would convert things over to sawing lumber. And just to give you one example of the kinds of amounts we're talking about here. So this is these are figures from 1860 in Rockbridge County. Grist mills that included sawmilling equipment processed about 5,600 logs worth $8,400. And those logs were sawn into almost 1 million board feet of lumber worth about $15,000. So they almost doubled the value of those logs by cutting them into lumber. And again, there are many, many examples of this. I share just this one with you. The species sometimes are named. They include pine, red and white oak, poplar, and cherry, at least in Rockbridge in 1860. I know that you heard, many of you probably came to the last lecture in this series, which was about iron, and so I'll gloss over this fairly quickly, but you know, there's a lot of iron ore in the surrounding mountains here, over the Blue Ridge, but also to our west in the Alleghenies. And so we see in the valley the building of a lot of iron furnaces for the production of pig iron. And, so here's the ruins of a furnace in Shenandoah County. I think it's Catherine Furnace. And this is what a pig looked like. This one I had in my office for a long number of years. A friend gave it to me. It came out of the canal basin in Richmond. Apparently, when boats turned around in the basin, sometimes they capsized and they would lose their loads. And so when they did a lot of rebuilding of that area back in, I don't know, in the 70s or 80s, I don't know. I was told, but I don't remember. They fished a lot of these pig iron, pigs, out of the river. So this one came into the hands of my friend, and you can't really see it well. Maybe you can see some letters there along the left-hand side. That's a stamp that says Vesuvius. Again, you can't see it well here, but this, I took it home and weighed it. This particular pig weighed 120 pounds. I'm told that that's larger than average. I don't know. I've not weighed any others, any pigs other than this one. But this one weighed 120 pounds and it was 28 inches long. I got tired of carrying it around, and my instruction from the friend who gave it to me was that when I was finished with it, I should take it to the Rockbridge Historical Society and give it to them, and so that is what I did. If you want to see this in person, it's in the collection of the Rockbridge Historical Society. We also had forges that would take pigs and create bar iron for use by blacksmiths and wheelwrights, for example. But they also manufactured equipment themselves, like stoves and cookware, farming tools, and implements. So a key point here, then, is that the great majority of these manufacturing establishments of all types were rural-based. Manufacturing activity tended to be decentralized and not located in towns, with the result that towns didn't directly benefit from the entrepreneurship of manufacturers. Historians looking at lots of societies across time tend to associate manufacturing with urbanization. Towns grow larger when we see more manufacturing. And that doesn't happen in the valley, not in the short term at least. It doesn't happen in the 19th century. It begins to happen by the middle of the 19th century. So that relationship doesn't seem to prevail in the valley during this period. So throughout the period under discussion this evening, primary economic activities, farming and resource extraction, dominated the regional economy. And in the secondary sector, the main enterprises involved the processing of crops or raw materials for the production of flour, iron, whiskey, textiles, leather, and lumber. And it's interesting to me, I found some canal boat data, the canal going out of Lexington, that the data included numbers for September of 1854 to September of 1855. And I should say the canal opened in just a couple of years earlier than that, 1852. And far and away, the items that were the heaviest, that were carried the most on these canal boats were flour and iron. So wheat and flour, there were over 4 million pounds. Pig iron, over 4 million pounds as well, and there was only a little over 1,000 pounds of difference between the two. But these were, again, far and away higher than anything else hauled on the canal. during that period. Though it's interesting to note that there was some whiskey, there was leather, there was lumber. I didn't see any textiles, however. I think that's too late. I think that looking at the agricultural schedules for this period, there are very few farmers continuing to grow flax in the 1850s and 60s. So again, I think it's died out by then. However, I did see a little bit of flax seed being carried on the canal in that year. So the Shenandoah Valley seems to have developed a very strong, robust manufacturing sector, but how did its size compare with the manufacturing sectors of other parts of Virginia? And here we can look at that. So what I did here, I had this manufacturing data that I'll share with you in just a minute, but I wanted to see the level of manufacturing activity in the valley, of course, but how did it compare with other parts of Virginia? And so I just sat down with a colored pencil one day, there's nothing scientific about this, and came up with what other regions that I could reasonably label. So you can see I picked, 5 counties there that look reasonable to call them the south side. We've got the Tidewater, the central Piedmont, the northern Piedmont, of course the Valley of Virginia, the Allegheny Highlands. And so I had these different regions, and what I did was to compile manufacturing statistics on them. I got a lot of statistics, but the one I'll share with you, because they all show about the same thing. No matter how you measure manufacturing activity, they show the same pattern. So what I have here is total capital invested in manufacturing per capita for all these regions of Virginia. And look at the Valley of Virginia. I was astounded by that the first time I saw it. And I'm thinking, I don't know, I need more research on this, but I'm thinking that this is because of the grist milling. Because this is the region where all the wheat's being grown. There's another region in Virginia that doesn't grow wheat to the extent that they do in the valley, but very, very high production levels, and that's the northern Piedmont. And you can see the northern Piedmont is the one that comes, it's still not remotely close, I don't think, but it's the highest of all the others. So I think this needs more investigation, but I think that's very interesting. And again, it shows the absolute dependence of the primary sector on activities of the secondary sector. And so now quickly to the service sector of the economy. I think we can develop a fuller picture of the regional economy with a snapshot of what we call the occupational structure of a given county. And you have a sheet with you. I think there was one on everyone's chair when you came in. And I can put it up here. I doubt that you can see it well from where you sit. And so just a number of quick, I'm running out of time, just a number of quick observations here. We can draw some broad conclusions. This shows data for 1860, but I also think that we can engage in what I like to call backward projection. Okay, so this is data from 1860, but these didn't spring up overnight in 1859. So I think that this is represents basically the kind of occupational structure that you would see in previous decades as well, albeit with some changes, certainly some changes. But I think it's not very different than what we would see during earlier decades. And what is crystal clear from the start this is a thoroughly agrarian society. So look at, if you will, look at the left-hand column where you see farming at the top and then labor just beneath it. And much of that labor probably would have been devoted to agriculture. They probably were working for farmers. We can't know how many of them, but I would guess a lot of them. And together they comprise about 75% of the entire occupational structure. Again, this is a thoroughly agrarian society. And so the manufacturing and services sector is taken up by the other 25%. And before I go further, I won't say a whole lot about these. I think it's fun to explore and make observations. But I do think that I should point out and remind us all that this was a slave society. Right? Slavery in the valley as a whole, approximately 20% of all people who lived in the valley in the pre-Civil War era were slaves. And that matches Augusta County. Augusta County was 21 or 2%. Okay? slaves in 1860. Rockbridge was 25%. It's highly uneven. Shenandoah County was only 6%. Clark County was 50%. But the point we want to make here, the point we want to understand, is that slaves contributed to this economy enormously, but they're not accounted for here. They're nowhere on this sheet. These occupations come from what we call the schedules of free inhabitants. There were separate schedules for the slaves. So I want to make it clear that we're not counting slave labor here at all. I guess the next observation I would make, and you can make it with me, you have the data right in front of you, is that there are a number of occupations here that have relatively high numbers. So look at the building trades. Let me see if I can use this thing. You probably can't read it there. You can see where it is on your sheet, though. Look at the building trades. There are a lot of carpenters, right? 83 carpenters. That tells us something. This is a society that is growing. This is a society that is attracting population. And there, from 1830 to 1840, the population in the entire valley fell by about 4,000 people, but in every other 10-year period, it rises 4, 5, 6, 7,000 people. So it's a society that is growing. Of course, there's a lot of building going on, so you can see a fairly large number of people in the building trades. The transportation trades are also quite large. I'll say more about this in just a second, but wagon makers, 17 of them. Transportation services.